Get her out. The words didn't echo. They cut. Clean. Final. The room stilled like someone had pressed pause on a world that only moved when Richard Coleman allowed it. His voice hadn't been loud, but it didn't need to be. Power didn't shout. It expected. And everyone obeyed. 2 security men shifted immediately, their polished shoes gliding across the marble floor, each step measured, professional, practiced. No hesitation. No questions. Just execution. At the far end of the room, near the glass wall where the city stretched out in clean lines of steel and light, Maya Johnson stood still, one hand lightly resting against a silver tray that reflected the overhead chandelier in fractured gold. The tray trembled, just slightly, barely noticeable, but her eyes didn't. They stayed steady, focused, calm in a way that didn't belong in a room like this. A room built on control, on dominance, on decisions that moved markets and erased companies overnight. Someone near the table let out a quiet scoff. Another leaned back in their chair, arms crossed, watching like it was entertainment. No one intervened. No one ever did. Richard didn't even look at her again. He had already turned back to the contract in front of him, a thick stack of paper resting beneath his hand like it belonged there, like everything did. His pen hovered just above the signature line. Waiting. The air shifted as the security guards approached Maya, one of them clearing his throat softly, not out of discomfort, but out of routine. "Ma'am," he said, polite but firm. "You'll need to come with us." She didn't move right away. Not out of defiance. Not out of fear. Just stillness. The kind that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. Her fingers curled slightly against the edge of the tray, the cold metal pressing into her skin, grounding her. Then she looked up. Not at the guards. Not at the people whispering behind polished hands. At him. At Richard Coleman. He felt it. That look. Even without turning, something in his shoulders tightened, just for a second, like a thread pulled too tight beneath expensive fabric. But he didn't acknowledge it. He never acknowledged things beneath him. "If you sign that," Maya said, her voice quiet, almost swallowed by the space. But it landed anyway, slipping between conversations, cutting through the low hum of the room like something sharper. "Then sound. You won't recover from it." The guards paused, just for a fraction of a second. Enough to feel it. Enough for the silence to stretch, thin and fragile. Richard's pen stopped. Midair. A single executive shifted in his seat, glancing down at the document like it had suddenly changed shape. Someone else let out a soft, nervous laugh. "That's enough," another voice muttered under their breath. "She doesn't even know what she's talking about." But Maya didn't look away. Not from Richard. Not even when one of the guards gently reached for her arm. Her hand lowered from the tray, steady now, like whatever tremor had been there before had burned off into something else. Something quieter. Stronger. Richard finally glanced up. Just once. Brief. Calculated. The kind of look a man gives when deciding whether something is worth his attention. Their eyes met. For less than a second. But it lingered. Longer than it should have. There was no panic in hers. No apology. No scrambling to fix what she had just done. Just certainty. And that, more than anything, irritated him. "Remove her," he said again, colder this time, dismissing not just her, but the moment itself, like it had no right to exist. The guards nodded, guiding her toward the door, their grip firm but controlled. Maya didn't resist, didn't plead, didn't explain. She just walked, step by step, the soft sound of her shoes against marble echoing louder now in the silence that followed. As the door opened, a sliver of hallway light spilled into the room, pale and indifferent. She paused there, just for a second. Not enough to turn back. Not enough to speak again. Just enough to breathe. Then she stepped out. The door closed behind her with a quiet click. And for a moment, no one spoke. Richard exhaled once, sharp, controlled, then lowered his pen back to the page. The room resumed. Conversations picked back up. Chairs shifted. Someone poured water into a glass that clinked too loudly against crystal. Everything returned to normal. Almost. Because something had changed. Just slightly. Not visible. Not measurable. But present. And as Richard's pen hovered once more above the signature line, the echo of her voice didn't leave. It didn't argue. It didn't shout. It just stayed. Quiet. Uninvited. Certain. Coleman's hand hovered again, just a fraction above the signature line, the weight of the room pressing in without anyone saying a word. It was subtle, almost invisible, but something had shifted. He could feel it in the way the air sat heavier in his lungs, in the way the silence did not settle the same way it had before she spoke. Across the table, a senior partner adjusted his cufflinks, the soft metallic click unusually loud in the stillness. Another executive leaned forward, squinting slightly at the contract as if seeing it for the first time. No one mentioned her. Not directly, but she was there. In the pause, in the hesitation, in the way no one rushed him anymore. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose, steady, controlled, forcing his focus back to the page. He had reviewed this agreement 3 times already. His legal team had gone over every clause. There was no room for error. There never was. That was how he built everything he had. Precision, control, certainty. And yet, his eyes drifted. Not across the signature line, but upward. Page 14. His fingers shifted, flipping the paper with a smooth motion that betrayed none of the tension beneath it. The page settled with a soft whisper. Lines of dense legal language filled the sheet, clean, structured, familiar. He scanned. Once. Then again. Slower this time. A faint crease formed between his brows. Everything looked standard, someone said from the far end of the table. Too quickly, too casually. Richard did not respond. His eyes stopped on a paragraph buried deep within the text. A section that blended so well into the rest, it almost disappeared. Almost. His jaw tightened, just slightly. Across from him, a younger analyst shifted in his seat, pulling the same page closer, his finger tracing the lines as if following something he could not quite name. Is something off? The analyst asked, his voice careful, uncertain. Richard still did not answer. The room waited. Not for information. For permission. He read the clause again. Then once more. Slower, isolating each word, each phrase, each implication. It was subtle, not wrong at first glance, not even suspicious unless someone was looking for it. But once seen, it did not disappear. It expanded, quietly, like a crack in glass. His grip on the pen tightened. A memory flickered, not a clear one, just a fragment. Her voice, calm, certain, you will not recover from it. Richard set the pen down. The sound was soft, but it landed heavier than anything that had been said in the last 5 minutes. A few heads turned. The analyst across from him leaned in further now, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. Sir, he asked. Richard did not look at him. His gaze remained fixed on the clause, his mind moving faster now, running scenarios, outcomes, consequences. If interpreted one way, the deal was balanced. If interpreted another, it transferred risk entirely. Not immediately. Not obviously, but completely. Silence stretched again, longer this time. Different. No longer passive. Now it was charged. Pull the liability breakdown, Richard said finally, his voice lower, sharper, cutting through the room with renewed precision. The analyst blinked, then nodded quickly, tapping his tablet with sudden urgency. Screens lit up. Fingers moved. The rhythm of the room changed, no longer smooth, no longer controlled. There was friction now. Across the table, the senior partner shifted again, less comfortable this time. We have already reviewed that section, he said, forcing a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Richard turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. Review it again, he said. No anger, no volume, just command. The kind that did not need to repeat itself. The man nodded, slower this time. Seconds passed, then more. The analyst's face tightened as he scrolled, his fingers stopping mid-screen. His posture stiffened. Sir, he began, then hesitated. Richard looked up, direct, expectant. Say it, he said. The analyst swallowed. If this clause is triggered the way it is written, the liability does not split. A pause, a breath. It transfers. The room went still. Not frozen this time. Heavy. A different kind of silence. One that carried consequence. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes drifting for just a second toward the door that had closed minutes earlier. The echo of her voice did not feel distant anymore. It felt immediate. Absorption. Richard Coleman's company would carry everything if the deal collapsed. Every lawsuit, every default, every hidden liability buried beneath polished projections and confident promises. The kind of clause that did not destroy a business overnight, but hollowed it out slowly, quietly, until there was nothing left but the illusion of control. The analyst lowered his tablet slightly, his fingers still hovering over the screen as if unsure whether to keep digging or stop before finding something worse. Across the table, the senior partner's smile faded completely now, replaced by something tighter, something more careful. "It is a standard protection structure," he said, his tone measured, but no longer relaxed. "You are interpreting it too aggressively." Richard did not respond immediately. His eyes remained on the document, but he was no longer reading. He was calculating, running the numbers in his head, mapping out timelines, tracing the ripple effect this would have if executed as written. He had seen deals like this before. Not often, but enough to recognize the shape of them. Clean on the surface, engineered underneath. His fingers tapped once against the table. A small sound. Controlled. But it broke the last layer of stillness in the room. "Who drafted this section?" he asked, his voice calm, almost quiet, but sharper now, stripped of any distraction. The question did not float. It landed. Heavy. The senior partner leaned back slightly, buying time. "Our legal team collaborated with yours," he replied, deflecting without denying. Richard's gaze lifted slowly, locking onto him now, steady and unblinking. "That is not what I asked." The temperature in the room seemed to drop without anyone touching the thermostat. The partner's jaw tightened, just enough to notice if you were looking. "It came from our side initially," he admitted. A pause followed. Not long, but long enough. Richard nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, like a conclusion forming. Around the table, no one moved. No one checked their phone. No one shifted their chair. Even the city beyond the glass seemed distant now, muted behind the tension settling into the room like weight. Richard reached forward and closed the folder slowly, his hand pressing flat against the cover as if sealing something inside it. The deal was no longer the center of his focus. The mistake was, and how close he had come to making it. A flicker passed through his mind. Again, not the clause, not the numbers. Her. The way she had stood there, unshaken, speaking into a room that had already decided she did not belong in it. "You will not recover from it." He inhaled once, deeper this time, and for a moment, something unfamiliar pressed against the edges of his control. Not panic, not fear, recognition. He pushed his chair back slightly, the soft scrape against marble louder than it should have been. "This meeting is paused," he said, standing now, his posture straight, composed, but no longer detached. It was deliberate. A shift. Immediate. The executives glanced at one another, uncertain for the first time since they had entered the room. "Sir, we can revise the language," the senior partner began, but Richard raised a hand, not abruptly, just enough to stop the words before they could continue. "We will not revise anything," he said. His voice was firm now, final in a different way than before. "We will understand it." Silence answered him again. But this time, it was not obedience. It was awareness. He turned slightly toward the door, his eyes resting on it for just a second longer than necessary. The same door she had walked through minutes ago. The same door he had ordered closed. And for the first time since the meeting began, Richard Coleman realized something that did not sit easily in his chest. The most important voice in the room had already been removed. And she had been right. The door was still closed. That was the first thing Richard noticed when he stepped out of the boardroom. Not the hallway. Not the staff moving quietly along the walls. Just the door. Solid. Silent. Final in a way that now felt premature. He stood there for half a second longer than necessary, his hand hovering near the handle without touching it, as if opening it again might undo what had already happened. It would not. Behind him, the muffled voices of executives had started again, lower now, tighter, no longer confident. Numbers. Risks. Questions that should have been asked earlier. He let them fade. They no longer mattered in the same way. What mattered had already walked out. Richard turned, his shoes striking the marble with measured steps, moving down the hallway toward the elevators. The building felt different outside the boardroom. Larger. Colder. The polished floors reflected long. Strips of light from overhead panels, stretching beneath his feet like something endless and indifferent. Employees passed by, some glancing up briefly, then quickly looking away, sensing the shift in his pace, in his presence. He was not walking like a man who had just paused a multi-million-dollar deal. Guards exchanged a quick glance. Not confusion. Uncertainty. "She was escorted out, sir," one replied carefully. "About 10 minutes ago." 10 minutes. Richard nodded once, the number settling into place with a weight that felt disproportionate to its size. 10 minutes was nothing. 10 minutes was everything. Did she say anything? He asked. The guard hesitated, then shook his head. No, sir. She did not. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition. Of course she had not. She had already said what mattered. He turned his head toward the glass doors leading outside, the bright daylight beyond almost blinding compared to the controlled lighting inside. For a brief second, he remained still. Then he moved. Not rushed, not frantic, but with purpose now. A different kind of urgency. One not driven by control, but by the absence of it. And somewhere in the quiet space between each step, a single thought settled deeper than the rest. He had dismissed her in seconds, and it might cost him everything. The glass doors opened before he reached them, a silent sensor reacting to motion it did not understand. Outside, the air felt different. Warmer, less controlled. The city moved in its usual rhythm. Cars passing, people walking, fragments of conversations carried in brief currents of sound that disappeared as quickly as they came. Richard stepped onto the pavement and stopped. Just for a moment. His eyes scanned the space in front of him, not aimlessly, but with a focus that had shifted from dominance to search. She was not there. Not near the entrance. Not by the curb. Not among the people crossing the street or waiting at the corner for the light to change. 10 minutes. That was all it took for someone to disappear into a city like this. He exhaled slowly, his gaze narrowing slightly as he adjusted, recalibrating. She would not have gone far. Not quickly. Not with the way she carried herself. Measured. Grounded. He turned his head to the right, then the left, scanning again. This time not for presence, but for absence. For the small disruptions people leave behind without realizing it. A security camera mounted above the door angled slightly downward. A reflection in the glass. A figure that had been there moments ago. He stepped forward, moving with purpose now, his pace steady but no longer restrained. Across the street. A bus had just pulled away, its engine fading into the distance. A few pedestrians lingered near the corner, checking their phones, adjusting bags on their shoulders, moving on with their day. None of them were her. Richard moved down the sidewalk, his shoes striking concrete now instead of marble, the sound sharper, less forgiving. A block. Then another. The city stretched out in grids, each intersection offering another direction, another possibility. He slowed slightly, his eyes catching on something near a bench just ahead. A silver reflection. Familiar. The same kind of tray. Resting against the side of the seat, leaning carefully as if placed there, not discarded. And beside it, seated with her hands folded loosely in her lap, was Maya Johnson. She was not rushing. Not looking around. Not checking her phone. Just sitting. Still. The noise of the city seemed to move around her instead of through her, like she existed slightly outside of it. Richard stopped a few feet away, his presence casting a shadow that reached her before his voice did. She looked up. Not startled. Not surprised. Just aware. Their eyes met again, and this time, there was no room between them filled with executives or expectations or roles. Just space. Real. Unfiltered. For a second, neither of them spoke. The moment stretched, not uncomfortable, but deliberate. Then Richard broke it. You knew, he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the authority that had defined it earlier. Not a question, a recognition. Maya's gaze held his, steady as before, but softer now, not because she had changed, but because the room around them had. I read it, she replied simply. No emphasis. No attempt to impress. Just truth. Richard nodded once, his eyes shifting briefly to the tray beside her, then back. Why say anything, he asked. The question came out more honest than he expected. Less calculated. Maya glanced down at her hands for a moment, then back up at him, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes carried a weight that had not been visible before. Because you were about to sign it, she said. A pause. Then, quieter, and no one else was going to stop you. The words did not accuse. They did not judge. They simply existed. Richard absorbed them in silence, his posture shifting slightly, not weaker, but less rigid, as if something inside him had finally released its grip. Around them, the city continued, unaware, indifferent. But in that small space between a bench and a man who had almost made the wrong decision, something had already changed. And for the first time, Richard Coleman was not trying to control it. Richard did not sit down. Not yet. He remained standing a few feet from the bench, his shadow stretching across the concrete, stopping just short of her shoes. For a man used to controlling rooms, this distance felt unfamiliar. There was no table, no barrier, no position to hide behind, just presence, real and exposed in a way he had not felt in years. He glanced briefly at the street, then back at her, as if confirming the world was still moving the same way it had before. It was. Cars passed. A distant siren echoed somewhere far off. A couple laughed as they crossed the intersection. Nothing had changed out there. But here, something had. "You work in the building?" he asked, his tone steady, but different now. Less command. More inquiry. Maya nodded once. "Part-time," she said. "Evenings mostly. Filling in when they are short." Her voice carried no defensiveness. No attempt to justify. Just information. Richard's eyes flicked to the tray again, then to her hands, then back to her face, as if piecing together something he had never bothered to understand before. "And you just read contracts?" he asked. There was a faint edge of disbelief in the question, but it was quieter now, stripped of arrogance, replaced by something closer to curiosity. Maya tilted her head slightly, not offended, not amused, just considering. "I read what is in front of me," she replied. A small pause followed. Then she added, "Some things are not that hard to see if you are not rushing past them." The words settled between them, not sharp, but precise. Richard absorbed them without reacting, but something in his posture shifted again, subtle, internal. He had built his life on moving fast, on making decisions before hesitation could exist. It had always worked, until it almost did not. He finally stepped closer, stopping near the edge of the bench, close enough now that the distance between them felt intentional, not accidental. "That clause," he said, his voice lower again, more focused. "It was buried." Maya gave a slight nod. "That is usually where." "It is," she said. No emphasis. No judgment. Just fact. Richard let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting momentarily to the passing traffic, then back to her. "You could have stayed quiet," he said. This time, it was a question, not about logic, about choice. Maya's eyes softened just slightly, not with emotion, but with understanding. "Yes," she said. Then she looked down briefly at the tray beside her, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge, grounding herself in something simple. "But I have seen what happens when people do." Richard did not interrupt. He waited. The silence stretched, but it did not feel empty. It felt earned. "My brother," she continued, her voice steady but quieter now, "lost everything because of something like that. A clause no one paid attention to. A detail everyone assumed someone else had checked." She looked back up at him, her gaze meeting his fully again. By the time they understood it, it was too late. The city noise seemed to fade slightly, not because it stopped, but because something in the moment made it less important. Richard's jaw tightened faintly, not in resistance, but in recognition. This was not theory for her. It was memory. Consequence. He nodded once, slower this time. "I almost made the same mistake," he said. The admission came quietly, but it carried weight. Maya did not respond immediately. She just held his gaze, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not agreement. Not approval. Just acknowledgement. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them settled into something steady, something that did not need to be filled. Then Richard glanced back toward the building behind him, its glass surface reflecting the sky in sharp, controlled lines. "They would have signed it," he said. Maya followed his gaze briefly, then returned her attention to him. "Yes," she said. A pause. Then, gently, "Because they trust you to see what they do not." The words did not accuse. They reminded. And for the first time, that responsibility did not feel like power to Richard Coleman. It felt like weight. Richard did not answer right away. The weight of her words stayed where they landed, settling into him in a way that numbers and contracts never had. Responsibility. Not as authority, not as control, but as consequence. He lowered his gaze briefly, not in avoidance, but in thought. His mind moving through something slower now, less automatic. When he looked back at her, something in his expression had changed. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough. "What is your name?" he asked. The question came simple, direct, but it carried something new. Recognition. Maya held his gaze for a moment, as if measuring whether the question mattered now. Then she answered, "Maya Johnson." Richard nodded once, committing it, not just hearing it. "Maya," he repeated quietly, testing the sound of it in a way that felt unfamiliar. He had spoken thousands of names in his life. Most of them he forgot seconds later. This one did not feel like it would leave. A car passed behind them, the low hum of its engine fading into the rhythm of the street. A breeze moved through the space, light, carrying the scent of the city with it. Maya reached down and adjusted the tray beside her slightly, aligning it with the edge of the bench with careful precision, a small act that carried more control than anything that had happened in the boardroom. Richard noticed. He noticed everything now. "You said your brother," he continued, his voice steady, but quieter, more deliberate. "What happened to him?" Maya's hands stilled for a second, then folded again in her lap. She did not look away. She did not hesitate. But her answer came slower. "He trusted people who assumed someone else had checked," she said. No anger. No bitterness. Just clarity. And when things went wrong, there was no one left to fix it. Richard absorbed that in silence, his posture shifting again, not outwardly, but internally, as if something was rearranging itself inside him. "And you learned to check for yourself?" he said. Maya gave a small nod. "I learned that details do not care who you are," she replied. "They do not respect titles. They do not wait for you to be ready. They just exist." The simplicity of it landed harder than any argument could have. Richard let out a slow breath, his eyes drifting briefly toward the building behind him again, then back to her. "You were not wrong," he said. It was not praise. It was acknowledgement. Maya did not react to it. Not outwardly. She just held his gaze, steady, grounded, as if she had never needed validation for something she already knew. Another pause settled between them, but it did not feel empty. It felt balanced. "I should not have had you removed," Richard said. The words came without force, without performance. Just truth. Maya tilted her head slightly, considering him, not dismissing, not accepting, just understanding the weight of what he had said. "No," she replied softly. Not harsh, not forgiving, just accurate. The honesty did not sting. It settled. Richard nodded once, slower this time, as if agreeing with something he could not argue with even if he tried. He shifted his stance slightly, no longer looming, no longer positioned above her, just standing. "Present. Come back with me," he said after a moment, his voice steady, but different now. Not an order, not a command, an invitation. Maya's eyes searched his for a second, not for permission, but for intention. The city moved around them, unchanged, but something in the space between them held still. "Why?" she asked. The question was quiet, but it mattered. Richard did not answer immediately. For the first time, he considered it before speaking. "Because they need to hear you," he said. A pause. Then, more honestly, "And I need to listen." Maya looked at him for a moment longer, then down at her hands, then at the tray beside her. The choice was not rushed. It was not easy, but it was clear. She reached for the tray, lifting it carefully, her movements steady, deliberate. Then she stood, not above him, not below him, just level. And for the first time since he had walked into that boardroom, Richard Coleman understood what that felt like. They walked back in silence at first. Not awkward, not forced, just quiet in a way that allowed each step to settle into something real. Richard adjusted his pace without thinking, slowing just enough so they moved side by side, not ahead, not behind. The glass doors of the building reflected them as they approached, two figures returning from opposite worlds, now crossing into the same one. Inside, the lobby carried the same polished stillness as before, but the energy shifted the moment Richard entered. Heads turned. Conversations softened. A receptionist straightened behind the desk. The guards by the entrance stood a little more alert. And then they noticed her. The tray. The uniform. The same woman who had been escorted out minutes ago. This time she was walking in beside him. No announcement was made. None was needed. The contrast spoke louder than anything else. Richard did not slow. He moved with purpose, but it was different now. Less about control, more about direction. Maya walked beside him, steady, her posture unchanged, her eyes taking in the space without reacting to it. The marble floor reflected their steps again, but this time the sound carried differently, not sharp, not isolated, but aligned. They reached the elevator. The doors opened immediately, as if anticipating his arrival. Inside, The air felt cooler, quieter, contained. Richard stepped in first, then turned slightly, holding the space open without looking directly at her. Maya entered without hesitation. The doors closed. The ascent began. Floor numbers lit up one by one, counting upward now instead of down. The movement felt different. Intentional. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence held, but it was not empty. It was full of something forming. Richard finally broke it. "They will question this," he said, his voice low, not as a warning, but as acknowledgement. Maya glanced briefly at the panel of glowing numbers, then back ahead. "They already did," she replied. No emotion, just fact. Richard gave a slight nod. He could not argue with that. The elevator slowed, then stopped. The doors opened to the executive floor, where everything was quieter, more controlled, as if sound itself had been filtered before being allowed to exist. As they stepped out, a junior assistant looked up from her desk, her eyes widening slightly before she quickly looked back down, pretending to focus on her screen. News traveled fast in buildings like this. Faster than facts. They moved down the hallway together, the same corridor Richard had walked through earlier, but it felt shorter now. More direct. The boardroom door stood at the end, closed, holding inside it a room that had already begun to change without them. Richard stopped just outside it, his hand resting briefly against the handle. He did not open it right away. Instead, he turned slightly toward Maya. Not fully, just enough. "When you speak," he said, his voice measured, but different now. "They will listen. But not all of them will understand." Maya met his gaze, steady as before, unshaken by the statement. "They do not have to," she said. A pause. Then, softer, "They just have to see." The simplicity of it settled into him again, grounding something that had once been automatic but now required intention. Richard nodded once. Then he opened the door. The room fell silent immediately. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Heads turned in unison. And there she was. Not at the edge. Not in the background. Standing beside him. The same woman they had watched being removed minutes ago, now walking back in through the front of the room. No one spoke. No one moved. The shift was immediate. Visible. Tangible. Richard stepped forward, then stopped near the head of the table, not sitting, not reclaiming the space the way he normally would. Instead, he turned slightly, giving Maya the room without saying it out loud. A single gesture. Small, but enough. And in that moment, the power in the room did not disappear. It changed hands. No one invited her to speak. That was the first thing Maya noticed. Not a single word of introduction. No formal acknowledgement. Just silence. The kind that waited. The kind that tested. She stood where Richard had left space for her, the silver tray still in her hand, catching the overhead light in a soft reflection that moved slightly with her breathing. Around the table, faces shifted from confusion to curiosity, from curiosity to discomfort. A few avoided looking at her altogether. Others stared too long, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they thought they understood. A server did not walk back into a room like this. Not beside him. Maya did not rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch, let it settle, the way she had learned to do when words were not yet needed. Her eyes moved across the table once, taking in the contract, the tablets, the hands that had almost signed something they did not fully see. Then she spoke. "Page 14, she said, her voice calm, clear, not loud, but it reached every corner of the room. No hesitation, no apology, just direction. A few executives shifted in their seats, flipping pages instinctively, as if her words carried authority they could not explain. The analyst from earlier leaned forward quickly, already there, already looking. Maya took a step closer to the table, not entering the space, but aligning with it. Subsection C, she continued, her tone steady, guiding without forcing. Third paragraph. The wording changes the assumption of liability if the merger fails after execution. A pause. Papers moved. Screens adjusted. Someone cleared their throat quietly. Maya did not look at them. She looked at the clause. "It sounds protective," she said, "but it is not. It shifts all post-merger risk to your side. Completely." The room tightened. Not visibly, but internally. One of the senior executives leaned back, crossing his arms, trying to regain control of something that was already slipping. "That interpretation is aggressive," he said, his voice measured, but thinner now, less certain. Maya turned her head slightly toward him, not confrontational, just acknowledging. It is precise, she replied. No edge. No emotion. Just clarity. Richard stood a few feet behind her, watching, not intervening, not correcting, not leading. Just listening. The role he had never played in this room before. Maya reached out and placed the tray gently on the edge of the table, the soft contact grounding the moment, making it real. Then she pointed, not dramatically, just enough. If the clause is triggered, she said, your company absorbs every financial and legal consequence tied to the agreement. There is no cap, no shared responsibility. A longer pause followed. The analyst swallowed, his eyes scanning faster now. She is right, he said quietly, almost to himself, but the room heard it. Another executive leaned forward, his expression shifting from dismissal to concern. Why would that be structured this way? He asked, not to her, but to the room, to anyone who could answer. No one did. Maya lowered her hand, stepping back slightly, not claiming the space, not needing to. Because it is not meant to be obvious, she said. The words landed without force, but they stayed. Richard's gaze moved across the room, watching the realization spread, not all at once, but in fragments, in quiet shifts of posture and expression. The power he had once held through certainty was now being redefined through awareness. Maya remained still, her presence steady, her voice no longer needed for the moment. She had said enough. And in a room built on control, the most disruptive thing she had done was show them what they had missed. The silence that followed did not feel like confusion anymore. It felt like impact. One by one, the expressions around the table shifted, not dramatically, but undeniably. Brows tightened, postures adjusted, eyes moved from the document to Maya, then back again, as if trying to reconcile how something so small had been missed by so many. Richard remained still, his presence no longer dominating the room, but anchoring it, allowing what needed to unfold to do so without interruption. The senior partner cleared his throat again, but this time the sound did not carry the same confidence. We can clarify the language, he said, his voice careful, controlled, but lacking the ease it once had. Maya did not respond. She did not need to. The room had already moved past clarification. This was no longer about wording. It was about intent. The analyst spoke again, more firmly this time, his voice gaining weight as understanding settled into certainty. It is not just unclear, he said. It is structured to transfer exposure entirely. If this is triggered even once, we carry everything. A low murmur spread across the table, not loud, but enough to break the last illusion of agreement that had held the meeting together. Another executive leaned forward, his fingers pressing into the table as if grounding himself. Why was this not flagged earlier? He asked, not accusing, but searching. No one answered immediately, because the answer was not simple. It was not about oversight. It was about assumption, about speed, about trust placed in the wrong places. Richard stepped forward slightly then, not reclaiming control, but stepping into responsibility. Because we did not look closely enough, he said. His voice was steady, but it carried something different now. Ownership. The room quieted again, but not out of obedience. Out of attention. He let the words sit, then continued. That stops now. No emphasis. No raised tone. But the shift was absolute. Across the table, the senior partner straightened, his posture tightening as the balance of the room changed. We can restructure the agreement, he offered quickly. Remove the clause, rebalance the risk, ensure both parties. Richard raised his hand slightly. Not to dismiss. To pause. We will review every line, he said. Not just this one. The statement did not invite negotiation. It defined the path forward. Maya remained where she was, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her presence steady, no longer questioned, no longer dismissed. She had moved the room without raising her voice, without asking for permission, without needing validation. That alone had shifted something deeper than the contract on. The table. Richard turned his head slightly toward her, just enough to acknowledge her presence without pulling focus back to himself. Stay, he said quietly. Not an order. Not a request. A recognition of value. Maya met his gaze for a brief moment, then gave a small nod. Not for him. For the moment. Around them, the room began to move again, but differently now. Slower. More deliberate. Pages turned with intention. Questions formed before being spoken. The illusion of control had been replaced with something harder to maintain, but far more real. Awareness. And at the center of it, standing where she had once been removed, was the one person who had seen it first. The room did not return to what it had been. It could not. Something fundamental had shifted, not just in the contract, but in the way every person at that table now looked at it. Lines that once blended into the background were now examined, isolated, questioned. The rhythm of the meeting had slowed, but not out of hesitation. Out of intent. Richard remained standing, his hands resting lightly against the back of his chair, no longer seated above the discussion, but within it. Across from him, the senior partner flipped through the document again, slower this time, his confidence replaced by calculation. "We will need time to revise this," he said, his voice measured, but no longer leading. Richard did not answer immediately. His gaze moved across the table, not searching for agreement, but for awareness. He saw it now. In the analyst leaning forward, reading line by line. In the executive who had stopped speaking entirely, choosing instead to listen. In the subtle tension that replaced earlier ease. Then his eyes returned to Maya. She had not moved from her position. Not forward. Not back. Just present. Observing. Waiting only when needed. He straightened slightly, then spoke. "We are not revising anything yet," he said. The words were calm, but they redirected the room completely. The senior partner paused, mid-page. "We need to understand the full exposure first." A quiet acknowledgement passed through the table. Not agreement. Recognition. Maya stepped closer then, not to take control, but to contribute with precision. She reached for the document again, her movement steady, her focus clear. "It is not just this clause," she said, her voice even, carrying without force. Several heads lifted. The analyst looked up quickly. "There are cross-references," she continued, her finger moving lightly across the page, not touching, just guiding. "Sections that depend on this language. If it stays, they expand the impact." The analyst's eyes widened slightly as he followed along, flipping pages, connecting what had once seemed separate. "She is right," he said again, louder this time, more certain. "It is layered. If one part triggers, the others activate with it." A deeper silence settled in. Not shock now. Understanding. The kind that comes too late to ignore. One of the executives leaned back slowly, exhaling as if something heavy had just landed in front of him. "This is intentional," he said quietly. Not a question. A conclusion. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in clarity. "Yes," he said. "Just one word. Enough." Maya stepped back again, returning to stillness, allowing the realization to spread without pushing it further. She had shown them the structure. Now they had to see it themselves. Richard turned toward the senior partner, his gaze steady, no longer neutral. "We will not proceed under these terms," he said. The statement did not rise. It settled. Final. The partner nodded slowly, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by something more cautious, more aware. "Understood," he replied. Around the table, the shift was complete. What had started as a routine approval had become a full reassessment. And at the center of it, not leading, not commanding, but simply standing in truth, was the person they had dismissed first. Richard glanced toward Maya once more, not as a superior, not as a correction, but as acknowledgement. The kind that did not need words. Because in that moment, the room no longer needed to be controlled. It needed to be understood. And for the first time, it was. The meeting did not end with a signature. It ended with awareness. Papers were no longer being pushed forward, but pulled apart. Each page examined as if it held something that could no longer be trusted at first glance. The room had changed its purpose. What was once a place to confirm decisions had become a place to question them. Richard remained where he stood, his presence steady, but no longer imposing. He watched as the structure of certainty unraveled into something more deliberate, more honest. Across the table, the senior partner closed his folder slowly, the movement controlled but final. "We will need to withdraw and reassess," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of earlier confidence. No one challenged him. Not because they agreed, but because there was nothing left to argue. The foundation had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it. The analyst leaned back in his chair, exhaling as if he had been holding his breath for the last 10 minutes. His eyes moved once more across the document, then toward Maya, not with surprise now, but with respect that had formed quietly, without announcement. "We would have missed it," he said, almost to himself, but loud enough to be heard. Maya did not respond. She did not need to. The truth of it was already settled. Richard stepped forward then, closing the space between himself and the table, his hand resting lightly against the surface, grounding the moment. "This meeting is concluded," he said. "No emphasis. No performance. Just clarity." Chairs shifted as people began to stand, the sound of movement returning to the room, but softer, more measured than before. Conversations started again, but they were different now. Lower. Thoughtful. Focused on what had almost happened, not what had been planned. One by one, the executives gathered their materials, their movements slower, more intentional, as if each action now carried weight it had not held before. The senior partner gave a brief nod to Richard, then to Maya, a gesture that acknowledged both presence and consequence, before turning toward the door. Others followed, filing out in quiet succession, the room gradually emptying of voices that had once filled it with certainty. Within minutes, the space that had been so full was nearly still again. The glass walls reflected only a few remaining figures. Richard, Maya, and the table between them, now cleared of urgency, left with nothing but the document that had nearly changed everything. Maya reached for her tray, lifting it gently from where it had rested, her movements unchanged, consistent, grounded in something that did not shift with the room. She turned slightly, preparing to leave, the same way she had before. Without expectation, without pause. "Maya," Richard said. His voice stopped her, not sharply, but enough. She turned back, meeting his gaze, steady as always. There was a brief silence, not empty, but searching. Richard did not rush it. He had spent most of his life speaking, before silence could form. Now he let it exist. "Thank you," he said finally. The words were simple, direct, but they carried something he was not used to giving. Not authority, not instruction, gratitude. Maya held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod. Not dismissive, not overly accepting, just acknowledgement. "You saw it too," she said quietly. A pause. Then, softer, "You just needed a second look." The words did not diminish what she had done. They expanded what he could become. Richard absorbed that in silence, his posture shifting slightly, less rigid, more present. Maya turned again, this time continuing toward the door, her steps light, unhurried, as if nothing in the room had altered her path. And maybe it had not. But as the door closed behind her, leaving the room quiet once more, Richard remained where he stood, looking at the document that no longer held the same power it once did. Because now he understood something that could not be unseen. The difference between control and awareness. And which one truly mattered. The room stayed quiet long after she left. Not empty, but changed. Richard did not move right away. His hand remained on the table, fingers resting lightly against the surface as if the weight of the moment had not fully settled yet. The document in front of him no longer looked like an opportunity. It looked like a warning. Clean lines. Polished language. Hidden consequences. He had seen thousands of contracts in his life, but this was the first time one had felt personal. Not because of what it said, but because of what he almost missed. He straightened slowly, exhaling as he gathered the pages into a neat stack, aligning the edges with a precision that had once defined control, but now felt like something else. Care. Intention. A choice to not rush. Outside the glass walls, the city continued its rhythm, unchanged, unaware of how close something had come to breaking. Inside, the silence held. Not empty. Reflective. Richard walked toward the window, stopping just short of the glass, his reflection faintly visible against the skyline beyond. For a moment, he studied it. Not the suit, not the posture, but the man behind it. The one who had built everything on speed and certainty. The one who had learned to trust systems more than people. And the one who had almost ignored the only voice that mattered. He turned slightly, his gaze shifting back toward the door she had walked through. It was closed again. Just a door. But now it carried something else. A line between who he had been and who he might become. He stepped away from the window and moved toward his chair, but did not sit. Instead, he reached for his phone, the screen lighting up in his hand. A list of contacts appeared, names tied to power, to influence, to everything that had defined his world. He scrolled past them without stopping. Then he paused. Not on a name he recognized, but on a number he did not have. Maya Johnson. He did not have it. Of course he did not. He had never needed to. Until now. He lowered the phone slightly, considering, then turned toward the door and stepped out of the boardroom. The hallway felt different again, not because it had changed, but because he had. As he walked, employees glanced up, sensing something in his movement that was not as rigid as before. Less distant, more present. He reached the elevator and pressed the button, waiting this time without impatience, without checking his watch, without needing to fill the seconds with something else. The doors opened. He stepped inside. The descent began. Floor by floor, the building moved around him, but his mind stayed on one thing. Not the deal, not the risk. A moment, a voice, a decision. When the elevator reached the lobby, he stepped out and moved toward the security desk. The same guard from earlier looked up immediately. "Sir," he said. Richard nodded once. "The woman from earlier," he said. "Maya Johnson." The guard hesitated for a brief second, then nodded, recognizing the shift in tone and intent. "Yes, sir." Richard held his gaze, steady, but no longer distant. "I want her contact information," he said. A pause. Then, more quietly, "if she is willing to share it." The addition mattered. The guard nodded again, this time with understanding. "I will check, sir." Richard gave a slight nod and stepped back, his eyes drifting toward the glass doors, toward the city beyond. For the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about control. He was thinking about connection, about listening before deciding, about seeing before assuming. And as the sunlight filtered through the glass, casting soft reflections across the polished floor, Richard Coleman stood still, not as a man who had everything figured out, but as someone who had just learned how much he had missed. And for once, that did not feel like weakness. It felt like the beginning of something real. The lobby remained steady around him, but Richard no longer felt anchored to it the same way. He stood near the security desk, not impatient, not restless, just present in a way that felt unfamiliar. Time moved, but he did not rush it. A few employees passed by, their footsteps soft against the polished floor, their voices low, carrying fragments of ordinary conversations that no longer felt as insignificant as they once had. Everything seemed sharper now, more noticeable. The guard returned after a few minutes, holding a small notepad in his hand, his expression neutral but attentive. "Sir," he said, stepping closer. Richard turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "She did not have to give it," the guard added, as if clarifying something important. "But she did." He extended the paper. Richard took it carefully, not glancing down immediately, as if the act itself carried weight. "Thank you," he said. Simple, direct. The guard nodded once and stepped back. Only then did Richard look at the name and number written in clear, steady handwriting. Maya Johnson. The letters were unembellished. Precise. Like everything else about her. He held the paper for a moment longer than necessary, then folded it once and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, not treating it like information, but like something that should not be lost. He turned toward the glass doors again, the sunlight outside shifting slightly as the afternoon moved forward. The city had not changed, but his place in it had. He stepped outside once more, the air warmer now, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the subtle rhythm of life continuing without pause. He walked a few steps down the sidewalk, then stopped, his eyes scanning instinctively, not searching this time, just observing. People passed by without noticing him, without needing to. For the first time in a long time, that felt right. He reached into his jacket and took out the folded paper again, holding it between his fingers, the edges soft against his skin. His thumb brushed lightly over the name, as if confirming it was real. He pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up with a familiar glow, but his hand did not move immediately. He did not dial. Not yet. Instead, he stood there, considering something he had never needed to consider before. Not what to say, but how to say it. Because this was not a negotiation, not a decision, not a transaction. This was something else. Something that required more than certainty. It required honesty. He exhaled slowly, then slid the phone back into his pocket, leaving the number where it was. Not avoiding it, just choosing the moment. The sidewalk stretched ahead of him, lined with glass, steel, and reflections that once defined his world. Now they simply existed. He began to walk, not toward anything specific, just forward, his steps steady, measured, unhurried. As he moved, the memory of the boardroom felt distant, not because it had faded, but because it had already done what it needed to do. It had changed something, not in the deal, but in him. A woman passed by, balancing a stack of folders in her arms, her pace quick, her focus fixed ahead. Richard slowed slightly, giving her space without thinking. A small gesture, almost nothing, but it was new. The city continued to move around him, but he no longer felt the need to control it, to stay ahead of it, to define it. He simply walked within it. And somewhere beneath the surface of that quiet shift, something settled into place. Not certainty, not control, something better. Awareness. And for the first time, it did not feel like he had lost something. It felt like he had finally seen what had been there all along. That evening, the city softened. The sharp edges of glass towers blurred under the warm glow of streetlights, and the pace that had driven the day slowed into something quieter, more human. Richard Coleman stood near the window of his office, the skyline stretching out in front of him, no longer a symbol of control, but a reminder of how much he had once overlooked. The boardroom behind him was empty now. The document that had nearly been signed sat neatly stacked on the table, untouched, its power reduced to nothing more than ink and paper. He had read it again, line by line, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. And each time, he saw more. Not just the risk, but the pattern, the assumption, the blind spot. He turned away from the window slowly, his reflection fading as he stepped back into the room. The silence here was different from before. It did not carry tension. It carried clarity. He reached into his jacket and took out the folded paper once more, smoothing it gently between his fingers. Maya Johnson. The name felt familiar now, not because he had known it long, but because it had changed something that could not be undone. He walked toward the table, placing the paper beside the contract, the two resting next to each other like a quiet comparison between what almost was and what had been seen in time. For a moment, he stood there, looking at both. Then he picked up his phone. This time, he did not hesitate. He entered the number carefully, each digit deliberate, his thumb steady as he brought the phone to his ear. It rang once, then again. The sound felt longer than it was, stretching into the space between decision and response. Then a voice. Hello. Calm. Familiar. The same steadiness that had cut through the noise hours earlier. Richard did not speak immediately. Not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood, for the first time, that how he said it mattered more. Maya, he said finally, his voice quieter than it had ever been in that building. This is Richard Coleman. A pause. Not awkward. Just present. I know, she replied. No surprise. Just awareness. Richard allowed himself a small breath, something almost like a release. I wanted to ask if you would come back tomorrow, he said. A brief silence followed. Not rejection, not acceptance, just consideration. Not as staff, he added, his voice steady, honest. As someone we listen to. The words settled between them, simple but real. On the other end, Maya did not answer right away. The city hummed faintly through the line, a reminder that life continued beyond this moment. Then, softly, I will come, she said. No hesitation now. No condition. Just choice. Richard nodded once, even though she could not see it. Thank you, he replied. Not as a formality, as truth. The call ended, and the room returned to silence, but it no longer felt empty. It felt complete. Richard placed the phone down, and looked once more at the contract, then at the name beside it. He did not move them. He left them there, side by side. A quiet reminder. He had once believed power came from being the smartest person in the room, from speaking first, from deciding fast. But that day had taught him something different, something quieter, something stronger. And as the lights of the city reflected softly across the glass, Richard Coleman stood still, no longer trying to control what was in front of him, but finally understanding it. He had her removed because he thought she did not belong. But in the end, she was the only one who truly saw. And she did not change the deal. She changed the way he saw the world. And that was enough.